From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Jason Steinhauer. I'm a program specialist at the John W. Kluge Center. Today's lecture is presented by the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. The Kluge Center is a vibrant scholar center on Capitol Hill that brings together scholars and researchers from around the world to stimulate and energize one another, to distill wisdom from the library's rich resources, and to interact with policymakers and the public. The center offers opportunities for senior scholars, postdoctoral fellows, and PhD candidates to conduct research in the Library of Congress collections. And we offer free public lectures, conferences, symposia, and other programs, as well as administer the Kluge Prize, which recognizes outstanding achievement in the humanities and social sciences. For more information about the Kluge Center, I encourage you to sign up for our email alerts on your way out this afternoon, or to visit our website, loc.gov/Kluge. You can sign up to learn about future events, as well as opportunities for you to conduct your own research here at the Library of Congress. Today's program is titled 1871, The Ruins of Paris. It features Dr. Peter Brooks, currently a distinguished visiting scholar at the John W. Kluge Center. While at the Library of Congress, Dr. Brooks has conducted research on Gustave Flaubert, his novel Sentimental Education, and the tumultuous events in Paris in 1870 and 1871. 1871 has been called the terrible year, as Napoleon III's army was defeated in the Franco-Prussian War, and an insurgency called the Paris Commune followed. It was crushed harshly by the national government, and much of central Paris was burned as a result. Flaubert visited these ruins of Paris and found in them a lesson. If only they had understood the novel he had published some months earlier, the cataclysmic destruction never could have happened. Dr. Brooks will speak about this today during his talk. Dr. Brooks is Sterling Professor Emeritus of Comparative Literature at Yale University and is currently Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Scholar in the University Center for Human Values and the Department of Comparative Literature. At Princeton University, he directs a project on the ethics of reading and the cultures of professionalism. He was the founding director of the Whitney Humanities Center at Yale, and he has also been university professor at the University of Virginia. His publications include Henry James Goes to Paris, winner of the 2008 Christian Ghosts Award, as well as Realist Vision, Troubling Confessions, Speaking Guilt in Law and Literature, and Psychoanalysis and Storytelling. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, New York Review of Books, the New Republic, the Times Literary Supplement, the Nation, and London Review of Books, and his work has been supported by fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and most recently, the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress, where he has spent the past 4 months. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Brooks.
Let's find a place for my water bottle here. Jason, thank you very much. And before I begin, I want to extend my thanks as well to Mary Lou Rieker, Dan Torello, Travis Hensley, and all my colleagues here at the Kluge Center, which has been an absolutely wonderful place to do research and write. I recommend it to you all. In the book I've been writing here, I'm trying to tell the story of what the French still call the terrible year, as Jason mentioned, as lived by two great writers who were devoted friends, Gustave Flaubert and George Sand. George Sand, of course, a woman writer who used that pseudonym. And to talk also about Flaubert's novel, Sentimental Education, which he thought should have kept his compatriots from the catastrophe they were enduring. It was a year of almost unimaginable suffering, humiliation, defeat, hatred, fratricidal conflict, a year when war and surrender were followed by siege, cold, hunger, then class warfare on a scale never seen before, a national bloodletting that left France traumatized on the threshold of its most enduring experiment, with Republican government, even as it seemed poised to retreat into monarchy. By the end of the so-called Bloody Week at the end of May 1871, much of central Paris was a smoking ruin, and out of these ruins, modern France emerged. Now, to give as a background just the barest historical sketch of events, Second Empire France under Napoleon III, who became emperor a year after his coup d'etat on December 2nd, 1851, killed off the fragile Second Republic born of revolution in 1848. That Second Empire seemed immensely wealthy and powerful. Paris was the undisputed capital of Europe. But the empire came to an abrupt and unexpected end in the Franco-Prussian War, which began in July 1870. The war was totally unnecessary. I suppose most wars are, but this one certainly was. It was the result of diplomatic blunders and the deliberate provocation of the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who thought that war with France would strengthen his hand in unifying the German states under Prussian hegemony. French confidence in its army and its vaunted new chassepot bolt-action breech-loading rifle was unbounded, but certainly misplaced. Appallingly commanded and outmaneuvered, the French army quickly suffered loss after loss on the battlefield. Whole army corps were made prisoner, and then on September 2nd, so was the emperor himself. His fall quickly led to a quick revolution in Paris and the declaration of a new republic on September 4th. But the war was not at all over. The Prussian army advanced rapidly to Paris, captured the outlying forts built to defend the city, and put it under a siege that would last through a long, frigid winter. The government of national defense struggled to maintain the war effort and to keep the capital alive. The city of light went dark. Paris ran out of fuel and food. Trees were chopped down, the Bois de Boulogne razed. Eating became a greater problem with each passing day. The animals in the Paris Zoo were sacrificed, including the beloved elephants Castor and Pollux. They went largely to the tables of the rich, though. Butchers, having exhausted horses, dogs, and cats, began selling rats. Ersatz food was the rule, including coffee made from acorns. Besides, the Prussians began bombarding the city in the middle of the winter since they got bored of the French resistance. And that made life dangerous as well as precarious. By the end of January, the government reached an armistice with the Prussians with a stipulation that a new French assembly would be elected and empowered to make a final peace treaty. Paris finally began to see supplies arrive from the countryside, but national elections led to an ultra-conservative assembly with a majority of its members dedicated to restoring the monarchy, with the old political pro-Adolphe Thiers as provisional chief executive, and then to a peace treaty in February that surrendered the provinces of Alsace and most of Lorraine to the Germans, levied reparations of 5 billion francs on France, and stipulated a Prussian victory parade down the Champs-Élysées on March 1st. This capitulation seemed a betrayal of heroic Parisian resistance. When the new government in March then decided, this very conservative new government decided to terminate a moratorium on rent payments and commercial loan repayments, and also the repossession of items left in the pawn shops that the wartime government had decreed, there was also a sense of class betrayal. The trigger point was reached on March 18th when Thiers decided he needed to disarm the National Guard, which is a kind of civilian militia of dubious loyalty to the conservative government. He decided to disarm them by taking away its cannon, many of which had been purchased by published subscription and bore affectionate nicknames. Victor Hugo was the name of one of them. So during the night of 17th to 18th March 1871, official army troops climbed up to the Butte Montmartre to the Cannon Park, which you see in this photograph from the time, a very rare photograph, the only one of that National Guard Cannon Park. It was early morning, and the populace, mainly women at first, out to buy their bread, moved to protect the cannon. The troops ordered to fire on them refused. 2 generals were seized and then executed later that day. Thiers and his ministers fled to Versailles, taking the whole of the official government with them. So Paris then declared itself an independent commune. I'm not going to discuss the commune itself. It's a very complex subject that still divides historians. A sphinx to the bourgeois mind, Karl Marx called it. It marked an attempt at local government run by and for the people, by people meaning essentially the petite bourgeoisie, artisans and workers, a government without a single ideology, but with many strange strands of socialism mingled, and largely dominated by the Proudhon model of classic anarchism, the notion that power should be kept in the hands of those affected directly by its exercise. During its brief existence, 72 days, the Commune instituted some remarkable reforms, but it was from the start at war with the official government in Versailles, and its military effort was never adequate to the situation. Versailles, which is now the seat of the official government, waited for the regular army to reach full strength through the release of prisoners of war. Bismarck was only too happy to aid in crushing the Paris proletariat. When invasion came starting on May 21st, 1871, it was swift and brutal. Many of the commanders in charge had been trained in French colonial wars in Algeria and Mexico, and they treated the Parisian working class as if they were natives. They advanced inexorably through Paris in a methodical massacre. The retreating communaux tried to put a wall of fire between themselves and their attackers. This is a popular lithograph of the time by a man named Fichot. From enemy shelling and from defensive fires, central Paris was in flames. So I had 2 contemporary lithographs, that by Fichot and this showing the burning of the royal palace, the Tuileries Palace, right across from the Louvre, which we know today. These fires, of course, would become chief among the crimes of the Commune, along with the disastrous decision on the part of the newly created Committee of Public Safety towards the very end of the Commune to execute hostages held by the Commune, which included the Archbishop of Paris, Monseigneur Darbois. It was the other side that started executing hostages first, but still this wasn't a very good idea. Reprisal was brutal. Local commanders carried out summary executions on anyone suspected of engaging in the insurrection, sending the rest to Versailles in chains. Estimates vary, but most agree that around 20,000 Parisians were killed by the army during what became known as the Bloody Week, in this single week. Now, the novelist Gustave Flaubert, who had been following events from afar in his home in Normandy, came to Paris at the start of June, I think just as soon as the trains began running again. Not sure what date he took the train, but he was there by June 5th, which must have been just about as soon as was possible. And he toured through the ruins with his good friend Maxime Ducamp. And it's Ducamp who gives us the report that really lies at the heart of my book project. Ducamp writes, as we were looking at the blackened carcass of the Tuileries, of the treasury, of the Palace of the Legion of Honor, and I was exclaiming on it, he said to me, if they had understood l'éducation sentimentale, none of this would have happened. Now, l'éducation sentimentale, Sentimental Education, was Flaubert's novel published some 18 months earlier, which he intended as the history of his own generation, and which by this point had come to seem to him prophetic of the horrors of the terrible year. It's a novel that hadn't been very well received by its critics. It was largely misunderstood. In his view, if only his contemporaries had read it and understood it, they would have gained a political lesson. Well, I'll at the end of this talk say just a few words about that novel and why Flaubert thought it contained a lesson. But mainly, I just want to talk about the ruins and the record of them given by the contemporary photographers. Now, photography was coming of age in 1871, and catastrophe was a compelling subject. Think of the record of the American Civil War created by Matthew Brady and others just a few years earlier. Exposure times were too long to record action. You remember most memorable in Brady's photographs, essentially, are the corpses left after the battle, though there is one notable image of Paris on fire on the night of May 24th, taken by one Hippolyte Blancard. It's looking over towards the Ile de la Cité and the Préfecture de Police. During the brief reign of the Commune, there were portraits, photographic portraits of its leaders, often assembled at the seat of municipal government, the Hôtel de Ville. Then there were a number of posed photos of the barricades and those manning them in kind of staged defiance, including this of a barricade in Ménilmontant, workers' district that would in fact be the last part of Paris to fall to the Versailles troops during the Bloody Week. There's this, which was the masterpiece of the Commune's chief barricade builder, a man named Napoleon Gaillard, who I think figures in the background of that picture. I'm not sure I can use his pointer, but I think that's Gaillard, that figure there, with a lot of whiskers. The barricades were something of a communal fetish, but they proved largely ineffective since the Versailles troops, when they arrived, would smash through the houses on either side of the barricades, run upstairs to shoot down on the defenders, or come up from behind them and catch them between fires. The Butte Montmartre, where that cannon park stood where it all began, now belonged to the Communal. Wait a second. I've lost one in here. There it is. They're out of order. No, not out of order. I wanted to show that one first. That's the barricade in front of the Hôtel de Ville, the seat of municipal government going back over centuries in Paris, taken over by the Communal. And this one is taken by a man named Alphonse Liébert, whom I'll talk more about, one of the great photographers of the time. And you can see the shadow of his camera and of himself in the foreground then. Yes, back to the Butte Montmartre where it all began. It now belongs to the Communal, and this wonderfully evocative photo of cannon looking out from Montmartre over the Paris suburbs. It was very likely taken by a man named Bruno Braquehay, who had made a profitable business during the Second Empire photographing studio nudes, semi-pornography, if you will, but apparently became a Communal sympathizer and was in Paris during the whole of this period. He recorded, this man Braquehay recorded in a series of remarkable plates, the destruction of the column of the elegant Place Vendôme, which you know if you've ever been in Paris. That's as it stands today, reconstructed. It commemorates the first Napoleon, whose gilded statue as Roman emperor stands on top of it. It was sheathed originally in brass bas-reliefs made from the melted down cannon captured by the French army at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1804. It was by 1871 a familiar and generally beloved part of the Paris landscape. Yet it drew the particular ire of the Communal, who declared it to be, quote, a monument to barbarism, a symbol of brute force and false glory, an affirmation of militarism, a negation of international law, a permanent insult of the conquerors to the vanquished, a perpetual attack on one of the three great principles of the French Revolution, fraternity. It surely was all that, but its destruction seems a strange expenditure of energy and political capital, and it was, of course, quickly rebuilt after the fall of the Commune. Braquehay might be dubbed an early photojournalist in the sequence he creates about the destruction of the Vendôme column. I'm only going to give you a small selection here. We start with this kind of celebratory picture at the base of the column, the day of its destruction, with lots of communal, mostly in their National Guard uniform. In theory, every active male belonged to the National Guard, and that was the main source of most people's income during the Commune, the pay of the National Guard. But here you also have a mother with a boy who seems to be acting up at her feet. It's a kind of festive occasion. The next one shows you the column rigged for destruction and the Place Vendôme largely cleared. They're just people on the edges, these three men on horseback, as it's about to be pulled over. And then it's quite beautiful high-angle shot taken from a fifth or sixth store balcony. This is by a different prominent photographer of the time, Jules Andrieux. That's the column after it's fallen. And to conclude, a notably evocative picture of the statue of Napoleon from the top of the column, done up as Roman emperor, fallen in the dust like an assassinated Julius Caesar, the orb of the world is still clutched in his hand. This again by Bruno Braquet. I think this picture, more than any other, speaks to why the Communal wanted to pull down the column. They were against everything symbolized by the imperial Napoleon. Anyway, it's a curious series in which the Commune and its photographers seem to be intent on making a record of their own folly, willfully creating a kind of scar on Paris, which will be later cited among their chief crimes, anti-monumentalizing the city, so to speak. If they think they're facing a tribute to militarism and dictatorship, paradoxically, they make starkly visible before us what one of the guidebooks is going to call a day whose memory will never be effaced. Now, crime is a word that returns frequently in the guidebooks published for tourists in the ruins. There were a number of these produced with remarkable speed following the events to profit from the tourist industry, including, for instance, this collection of postcards. The word tourist industry I don't use lightly. Cook's in London, for instance, was offering organized tours of the ruins, and there came to be a resentment on the part of Parisians at the number of British who came to see the ruins, and as the locals saw it, gloat on over the results of French fratricide. And provincials who had been locked out of Paris, essentially, for the last year, flocked to the capital. Many of the guidebooks are simple pamphlets with itineraries through the ruins and comments on the destroyed buildings. Others are heavily illustrated with etchings or rotogravures, which one comes to recognize as having been made from the photographs of the ruins. There was no way of reproducing photographs in printed books at the time. Efficient photogravure was still some years in the future. But there are a few albums that are large format, luxurious affairs containing photographic plates. These were produced separately for each edition, then glued by hand into the volume. They're often of astonishing quality, as are many of the individual photographs produced for souvenirs and postcards and so on. One of the most impressive of these volumes is Alphonse Liébert. We saw that Liébert of the Hôtel de Ville with the shadow of the photographer earlier. This is his book, Les Ruines de Paris, of which the Library of Congress fortunately possesses a copy, and that's its title page. Just parenthetically, you see at the bottom that it's édité par la photographie américaine à Liébert. Liébert had originally set up shop in San Francisco and become a prominent West Coast American photographer before returning to France. The rhetoric of these guidebooks, though, is routinely anti-communal. The tropes become familiar: crime, wild beasts, insensate destruction, etc. As an author who calls himself Georges Bell puts it in his book Paris Incendié, Paris Burnt, in many quarters of Paris one finds what he calls vide accusateur, emptinesses that accuse the perpetrators. This language of the void, of the emptiness, is interesting. Another guide tells us quote, only photography with its brutal realism and its pitiless precision can represent these indescribable things that were houses, palaces, cities. Only photography can capture what now is from what once was. Then Alfred Daunet, who writes the text, this preface to Liebert's magnificent album, notes that war and civil war are now past and resemble a bad dream half forgotten. But, he goes on, this sight had the sun for witness, and the sun fixed on Bristol paper, that's photographic paper, this lugubrious souvenir. So photography is presented as the work of the sun as eyewitness and the fixing of the object of witness on paper. Photography is given what you might call a quasi-forensic role, producing unforgettable memorializations of sites that one would like to forget as from a bad dream. Daunet's remark captures a notion that comes back repeatedly in the discourse accompanying these photographs, that the ruins, which themselves record a kind of absence of what was once there, are something that should be effaced, blotted out, forgotten. As Georges Bell puts it, the more one looks at them, the more ardent becomes the desire to see them disappear. And yet, they are irresistibly made present by the photographs. The principal monuments, most notably the Hôtel de Ville and the Tuileries Palace, were nightmarish, unforgettable images of both absence and presence. Absences that refer to a lost presence, presences that make absence present, you might say. I offer only a selection from the many, many images of the Hôtel de Ville, perhaps the most photographed of all the ruins, the Renaissance building that had for centuries housed the municipal Paris government and which became the headquarters of the Commune. This photograph is by the great Charles Marville, whom some of you may know. He's been much exhibited, including in a big show at the Metropolitan in New York a few years ago. He had originally been commissioned to record Old Paris before Napoleon III and his lieutenant, Baron Haussmann, wiped it out. This was done, as you can see, a few weeks after the fire when the building is already surrounded by hoardings and clearance and reconstruction have already begun. And here is one of the many stark images of the interior of the building, this one also done by Marville. Then I want to show you an often reproduced Liébert photo, which looks like an action photo. Firefighters attempting to extinguish the blazing Hôtel de Ville, but on close inspection, and I had the opportunity to inspect it myself in Paris 2 summers ago, on close inspection, it's retouched. Someone has very cleverly drawn in those firemen, fire hoses, and smoke with pen and ink. This is the original from which it was made. And you can see how that tempted the retoucher to put in more figures and turn it into an action photo. But that's from the Liébert volume that the Library of Congress has. That retouched photo, I think you can consider fairly innocent compared to a number of photo montages from the time, recording events of the Commune, especially by a man named Eugène Appert, who published an album called Les Crimes de la Commune, the Crimes of the Commune, which depicted such crucial events as the execution of Generals Clément Thomas and Jules Lecomte on March 18th, the founding violence of the Commune, and the execution of Monseigneur Darbois and other hostages at the Roquette prison. These fakes are sometimes clever and were surely taken as evidence by many people, though their wooden quality is made evident by the genuine photographs. But they do these photo montages, which were sold as real, without any mention of what they were, do urge a certain caution when using photos as witness to events. Absence and presence was a crucial issue, too, on the practical level of stone and mortar in the question of rebuilding these destroyed monuments. The government that would soon preach moral order, that was the slogan of the reactionary government that came into power after the Commune, as its watchword, wanted to efface the Commune by ridding the capital of ruins just as soon as possible. And most of the functional public buildings, such as the Ministry of Finance and the Palace of Justice and the Cour des Comptes, were quickly rebuilt or replaced. This is very quickly what some of them looked like as viewed by Flaubert and Maxime Ducamp in early June. That's the Palais de Justice, photographed by Hippolyte Blancard from inside, the Ministry of Justice. That is the Ministère des Finances, Ministry of Finance by Liébert. No, that one's by Liébert. And then that one is by Hippolyte Blancard. Really remarkable photograph. The clarity of these photographs. As a colleague of mine said, photography has gotten faster since the 1870s, but it hasn't gotten any better, and I think that's true. And then the Théâtre Lyrique, theater that would be reborn again under a different name 3 years later. And in addition to the specific destroyed buildings, often those were crucial to the administration of the city and the nation, there were also whole areas of the city that suffered heavily from damage. On the right bank, that length of that major artery, the Rue de Rivoli, in a photo that gives you a sense of the remarkable depth of field that's achieved in some of these photos. And I don't know who that's by. I suspect it's Blancard or perhaps Marville, but it's just presented as anonymous. And then on the left bank, not far from Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the Carrefour La Croix-Rouge, the scene of an intense onslaught against communal barricades. That's another photo by Liébert. And done a few days after the events, because someone's already put up a sign saying that the shop that used to be there has moved elsewhere. All these would have to be made whole again, and they were with notable speed. The rapidity of French recovery from war, siege, invasion, and then civil war astonished observers, and the rebuilding of Paris was an urgent part of national restoration. Now, the Hôtel de Ville, which was commissioned originally in the 16th century by François Ier, King Francis I, was crucial both practically and symbolically. Some proposed replacing the ruined building with a new design, but the government quickly opted to restore and reuse the Renaissance building while going 19th century for the interior. Work proceeded apace so that the many haunting images of its ruined condition would become a kind of counterproof of French resolve. It stands today slightly enlarged from the original, a defiant reproduction. As for the Tuileries Palace, another of the most dramatic ruins, there ensued a long and heated debate as to whether and how to restore it. This is the Salle des Maréchaux, one of the principal reception rooms inside the Tuileries Palace, again by Alphonse Liébert. Now, if the restoration of the monarchy in the person of the Comte de Chambord, the Bourbon pretender, crowned as Henry V, Henri V, had taken place in 1873, as at one time seemed really inevitable, it is certain the palace would have risen again. But Chambord stymied the return of monarchy by refusing to accept the tricolor French flag, the red, white, and blue flag, insisting on a return to the white flag of his ancestors, the Bourbons, with the fleur-de-lis on a white ground, proving once again the adage that the Bourbons learned nothing and forgot nothing. He went back into exile, and in the failure of restoration, even the conservative Republic of Dukes that followed upon the fall of the Thiers government had trouble mustering much enthusiasm for rebuilding what had come to seem a symbol of tyranny and excess. The debate ended only in 1882, when the Republicans were now firmly in charge of the government, with a decision to raise the ruins and remove the debris, thus creating the Place du Carrousel right outside the Louvre as we know it today. Nonetheless, I discovered that there is still an active national committee for the reconstruction of the Tuileries, run by people who need to have their memories take literal physical form. Now, the message from the government and the official sources of information was all about forgetfulness and erasure. The Commune would soon become virtually unmentionable, fallen from official history. And yet, there is this phenomenon of the several guidebooks produced precisely to publicize the ruins, and there were the visitors who purchased them and, like Flaubert, toured the city. What did it mean that these symbols of national defeat, class warfare, and heedless destruction became a privileged site of tourism and of sightseeing? The rhetoric of wishing to see and wishing to cover over the site returns again and again in a contradiction that I don't think can be resolved. At work, I suppose, is our inevitable attraction to the site of cataclysmic happenings, from earthquakes to highway accidents, along with the accompanying wish that they hadn't happened. But something else seems to be going on here as well. In part, it seems to have been the eerie beauty of the ruins themselves, evoked in a number of guidebooks and commentaries. So along with the desire to remove the emblems of destruction by making present again the buildings recorded in their absence as photographed ruins, there was a concurrent discourse of fascination with the beauty of the ruins, a first wish that they might be preserved. Many Parisians, as well as visitors, were captivated by the images of a living city instantly reduced to lifeless rubble in the manner of Pompeii, the ruin created by an instant cataclysm. The guide À travers les ruines de Paris notes that the Rue Royale, which I show you here, is the street of another Pompeii, shaken by the eruption of the volcano of a populace blinder in its furies, more stupidly brutal than Vesuvius or Etna. That's the Rue Royale. And that comparison to Pompeii becomes a commonplace. And yet the results of volcanic eruption, here the volcanic eruption of the crowd, are beautiful. The same guidebook notes of the Hôtel de Ville that it is black, white, bluish, reddish, rose, so intense was the furnace that cooked and recooked it. We have no color pictures from the time, of course, so we don't really know what it looks like. But apparently stone set afire with petrol, which was what they used to create these fires, takes on wonderfully enticing iridescent colors. The poet Théophile Gautier, viewing what remained of the Cour des Comptes, said, above all, we were struck by the beauty of the ruins. And the novelist and art connoisseur Edmond de Goncourt, wandering through Paris the day after the fighting ended, developed in his journal the full aesthetic of the burned Hôtel de Ville. He said, the ruin is magnificent, splendid. Ruin in tones of rose, of ash green, of white-hot iron, a ruin shimmering in the agate color taken by stone burnt in petrol. It resembles the ruin of an Italian palace colored by the sun of many centuries, or better still, the ruin of a magic palace lit up in an opera with shimmering electric reflections. It's a marvel of the picturesque. It should be preserved. And another guide, Guide à travers les ruines, written by Hans and Blanc, notes, the Ministry of Finance, which in the past was only a mediocre edifice, has become a superb ruin. Fire is a worker of genius. Again, we have the Pompeian reference. It makes one dream of a city swallowed up by a cataclysm. To Gautier, the Ministry of Finance looked like the Colosseum. The ruins have a kind of antique beauty, as here in the remains of what was known as the grenier d'abondance, the granary or storehouse, which was filled with substances against possible future famine, and was full of wine, oil, and petrol, and of course went up like a torch. This is a photograph by Jules Andrieux recording the grenier d'abondance. So you have in the rhetoric of the guidebooks and tourist reactions to the ruins a simultaneous lament on the destruction wrought by the Communale, the work of a kind of human volcano, and a meditation on the seductive beauty of this instant Pompeii. The ruins resurrected the earlier fascination of the Romantics and Gothic revival with a picturesque ruin, the sentiment that led the moneyed to have instant ruins created on their estates, for instance, and to books such as Count Volney's The Ruins of Empire. And here, of course, the tourist was, in a sense, viewing the ruins of an empire, that of Napoleon's Second Empire, which had seemed such an affluent, powerful, enduring regime until it undid itself in the war with Prussia. Now, you see the ruins aesthetic in full flower in a rare oil painting of the Tuileries, done by Ernst Meissonier, who was famous as a painter of Napoleonic battles and became almost an official court painter under the Second Empire. This first is Andrieux's photograph of the peristyle inside the Tuileries Palace. And then here is Meissonier's using the same general sight line through the palace. Possibly working from a photograph, Meissonier looks through the ruined Salle des Fêtes of the palace out towards the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel, which is still there, which was originally part of the palace complex, but now stands alone in the Tuileries garden, itself a kind of evocation of the palace that once was there. Meissonier described the arch with its imperial figure in a chariot drawn by 4 horses as, quote, victory on her chariot abandoning us. But others view this glimpse of past glory through the ruins as promise of a better future, the rebirth of France. The painting, of course, stands in a tradition going back to people like Piranesi and Hubert Robert, a tradition of evocative ruins, which are often meditations on the transitory nature of human works and aspirations. Meissonier explicitly inserts himself in the tradition of painters of Roman ruins with the Latin inscription he puts on the escutcheon at the bottom of the painting, Gloria maiorum per flammas usque superstes. The glory of our forebears survives through the flames. And then May 1871. Predicting a greater future to the survivors of the flames, an image of purification by fire that would return again and again. And on the walls of the ruins, though you can't see them in this reproduction, there are inscriptions of Marengo and Austerlitz, 2 of the first Napoleon's great victories. So I think his canvas captures that mixture of emotions we find in the guidebooks, a sense of irrecoverable loss, along with a fascination with the ruins left in the wake of loss, and also an obligatory hope for the future. Since the work of critics like Roland Barthes and Susan Sontag on photography, we've become acutely aware, I think, of the cohabitation of the photograph with death, the haunting sense that the instant made present in the image no longer exists. That's why it's an image. This death effect is strangely redoubled in the case of photographs of the remains of what once was. The point can be starkly illustrated by the most famous photo from the Bloody Week, probably taken by a man named Eugène Disdéry, who earlier invented the calling card embellished with a photographic portrait, which expanded photography throughout the middle classes. This is bodies of the executed communards in their coffins. The circumstances and intention of this stark, haunting, and nearly unbearable photo remain conjectural. It somehow looks like an official act of witnessing, and some have suggested that Disdéry took the photo at the behest of the victorious Versailles to record the dead, though that's not very persuasive when you think of the fact that most of the dead went totally unrecorded and were just thrown into unmarked mass graves. In any event, the photo authenticates more than any other document I know the horror of the event. And it's incidentally one of just 2 or 3 authentic photos of the victims. There are a lot of other ones that are posed of troops and civilians in artfully arranged bodies. Whereas Brady's American Civil War photos often record bodies mowed down like wheat fields, with the exception of Disdéry's photo, the bodies are largely absent, I think probably because they were carted off the scene and hastily buried so quickly by a government anxious to erase any trace of them. There's also an act of artistic witnessing, less horrifying than the photo, but equally tragic in his way, in a sketchy lithograph by Edouard Manet, who left Paris after the armistice but returned during the Bloody Week, called simply Civil War. The very lack of photos of the action of the Bloody Week, the way in which emphasis has been thrown forward instead onto the ruins, suggests a specific form of intervention of the photograph in the historiography of this moment. The visually recorded history of the life and death of the Commune is the ruins left in their wake. The burning of Paris becomes the unforgettable and unpardonable record. That may explain why the image of the largely mythic figure of the pétroleuse, the proletarian woman running from building to building with a milk can filled with petrol and setting fires, became so dominant in the first journalistic histories of the Commune. The pétroleuse probably never existed. She's a figure invented to create a dramatic and infernal narrative of the burning of central Paris. She's in a sense a fictional narrative that results from the photographs of the ruins. Recall Alfred Donet's words in the Liébert volume. This site had the sun for witness, and the sun fixed the image on photographic paper. The witnessing of the Commune is largely in those ruins. Photography, in this sense, inflects history. It produces fictions of the events whose outcomes it records. Though the memorialization of historical event was by this point in the 19th century clearly a central role for photography, the ruins of Paris photographs make a different kind of contribution to the creation of history. They take on a forensic role while the events are still ongoing in public memory, while the trials of the Communale, for instance, are going forward in Versailles. They offer a kind of factual support for the existence and the death of the Commune, its trace left in the destruction of central Paris. Roland Barthes, to refer to him once again, writes, quote, "Perhaps we have an invincible resistance to believing in the past, in history, except in the form of myth. The photograph for the first time puts an end to this resistance. Henceforth, the past is as certain as the present. What we see on paper is as certain as what we touch. It is the advent of the photograph and not, as has been said, of the cinema, which divides the history of the world. In the absence of action photographs, in the aftermath of the massacre of so many of the Communale, including their leaders, the mute testimony of the photographed ruins allows the construction of this history. There will be other kinds of memorialization in the wake of the Commune. Since there was an official wish to silence the history of the terrible year, most of the early discourses of the Commune are wholly negative. Memoirs by surviving Communale could not be published in France. Some of them were published in Belgium and elsewhere. Only after the amnesty voted in 1880 and the return of surviving Communale from their exile in New Caledonia do we begin to have a fuller public record of the event. One has to await the 20th century for there to be a commemorative plaque to the dead of the Commune affixed to the so-called Mur des Fédérés at the foot of Père-Lachaise Cemetery, where a massacre of Communale took place on the next to last day of the Bloody Week, where they were lined up row after row and slaughtered. The wall became a site of memory with the annual so-called montée au mur, the going up to the wall that from 1880 onward gathered socialists, communists, and other left formations with tributes oral and floral every May in commemoration of the Bloody Week. It reached its apogee during the Popular Front in 1936 with a crowd of some 600,000. Now, I want in this context to talk, but not today, I spare you that, about some displaced memorializations of the Commune. First, Victor Hugo's remarkable novel 93, 93, named for the year of the Reign of Terror during the original French Revolution, which he wrote in the immediate wake of events and published in 1874 with the explicit desire to reconcile the opposing camps of his compatriots. And then another, to me somewhat more sinister kind of novelization of history in the building of the Basilica of the Sacré-Cœur atop the Butte Montmartre as expiation for the sins of Republican France in response to a so-called national vow. The complex history of the Sacré-Cœur, both the church and the cult of the Sacred Heart of Jesus that lay behind it, is a notable story of reactionary France pushing its views on the nation in the wake of disaster. The building of the basilica was declared of public interest by the National Assembly in 1873, this very conservative monarchist assembly, allowing the symbolic site up on Montmartre, where the communal cannons had stood, to be taken by what we would call eminent domain. Built where the Commune had begun its reign, it was designed to rise high above the Pantheon, the home of such impious figures as Voltaire and Rousseau, the fathers of Republican France. Successive Republican governments then attempted to kill the project, but in vain. As finally completed, not until 1914, it not only dominates the Paris skylines, but contains within it mosaics memorializing some strange heroes of the far right, next to 4 archbishops of Paris offering the basilica to Paris. We have the authors of the national vow made during the Franco-Prussian War and the subsequent destruction to build the church, a man named Alexandre Logentil and Hubert Rouault de Fleury. And then behind them, Generals de Saunus and Charette, and the second of them in his papal Zouave uniform. These were descendants of the Vendéen resistance to the French Republic during the Great Revolution, who had then gone off to defend the Pope against Italian Republicans. And then in December 1870, they joined the French army, though as a separate battalion, under the banner of the bleeding heart, the bleeding Sacred Heart of Jesus, and led a final chivalrous but absurd charge at the Battle of Loigny, where they were both severely wounded and accomplished nothing. And then behind them you have Louis XVI and his family kneeling while dedicating France to the Sacred Heart in what was said to be a vow he made when he was in prison imprisoned by the Jacobins during the French Revolution. He was going to devote France to the cult of the Sacred Heart if he was released. When he wasn't released, but instead was guillotined, this cult of the Sacred Heart became even stronger among anti-Republicans. And in the back of the scene, leaning against a pillar, you have an indifferent and impious proletariat, what they called in the French Revolution a sans-culotte, who looks disdainfully on the scene. Really remarkable, and most French don't know what's going on up in those mosaics. They're hard to see. Gallia penitens et devota reads the inscription over the entrance to the church. France, penitent, reclaims her place as an elder daughter of the church. I think it's quite odd that glorious Paris should be crowned with this monument of penitence. Now, the upsurge of nationalist feeling led also to a new cult of Joan of Arc, who came from the province of Lorraine, which had now passed largely into German hands. Joan was the symbol who finally could rally both right and left, the spirit of the nation who saved the French monarchy, but also began as a humble peasant woman. Here she is as the heroic Joan in the gilded statue by Emmanuel Frémier, erected in 1874, that still today stands in the Place des Pyramides in Paris. And then this somewhat stranger attempt by the painter Jules Bastien Lepage to portray her as a peasant girl called to by Saint Michael, who hovers in the background in gilded armor in her parents' back garden, their potager. Now, as for Flaubert, like the entire middle class of France, he thought the Commune was a criminal mistake. You don't find anyone in the French bourgeoisie defending it. But he blamed the reaction to it even more. Those with power and supposedly with education are the more to blame in what he sees as an immense treason against civilization itself. During that visit to Paris in early June of 1871, he wrote a letter to his confidant, Georges Sand. I am overcome, or rather nauseated. The odor of the corpses disgusts me less than the swamps of egotism exhaling from all mouths. The sight of the ruins is nothing next to the immense Parisian stupidity. With some very rare exceptions, everyone appeared ready for the madhouse. Half the population wishes to strangle the other half, which reciprocates the sentiment. You can read that clearly in the faces of the passers-by. And the Prussians no longer exist. People excuse them and admire them. Reasonable people want to become naturalized Germans. I assure you, it's enough to make one despair of the human species. Now, what I claim in my book is that a rereading of this novel, Sentimental Education, published in November of 1869, that is just shortly before the war breaks out and leads to its awful sequels, when you set the novel in the context of the terrible year, does read as a history lesson to his contemporaries. It takes its place in a long line of 19th century historical novels, but in a strangely prophetic mode. You might say it's part of a more general novelization of history going on in this period that sets large historical forces in play against the individual's understanding, or in Flaubert's case, more often non-understanding of the forces that he or she has to deal with. Recall that Marx called the Commune a sphinx. Flaubert is much interested in the sphinx of history, but not convinced that questioning her will get you an answer. He rather wants to make us understand how we have to live in the shadow of that unresponsive sphinx. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. I would be delighted to have your questions, and Jason tells me we do have about 10 minutes. So if you have them, ask away. Yes. Oh, yes, there's a microphone.
You showed pictures of ruined offices. You showed pictures of ruined, the Hotel de Ville, of neighborhoods. You showed no pictures of damaged churches. Were there no damaged churches, or were they not photographed? Or Paris has lots of nice churches.
That's interesting. There were damaged churches, particularly in the west of the city, in Auteuil and Saint-Cloud. I think that damage came more from the Prussian bombardments than from the Commune. So far as I know, the Commune did not set fire to any of the churches. They were anti-clerical in many ways, and a number of the churches became places for political meetings during the Commune, but they didn't undertake any destruction. The Commune actually was a rather peaceful period, and there are lots of contemporary accounts of how pleasant it was to live in Paris under the Commune. It's just at the time of the Versailles attack that they start burning things. And one could talk a lot about the motives of those burnings. I mean, essentially, I think it was a defensive maneuver, right? Set up a wall of flame between you and but some of it may have also been vindictive, particularly the Tuileries Palace. Some of it may have been wanting to cover their tracks, because when they burned the Hôtel de Ville, they burned all the records of what they had been doing. Yeah. Yes? You better wait for the microphone, which is coming by.
Thank you. At the time he wrote Madame Bovary in the 1850s, his bête noire was the French bourgeoisie. And I was wondering, by this time, had he tempered his views? The Third Republic was a bourgeois government. Did he become more moderate in his estimation of the French middle class? And had he ever espoused any kind, I don't know if he ever did, any kind of empathy for the working class, the proletariat?
Good questions. He always remained a bourgeois phobe throughout his life, but curiously, almost without his realizing it, in the wake of the Commune and its suppression, he becomes a Republican, and he says very interesting things about the Republic. And the Republic is unstable for quite a while. It's only, in the late 1870s that it really gets firmed up. He says he likes it because it has no ideology, that it's just getting on with things. But he continues to attack the bourgeoisie. He reads all the political platforms of the candidates for the assembly from Normandy. This is around 1874. And he writes to George Sand, what we have to do is enlighten the enlightened classes because they know nothing. And he said that he says that the proletariat isn't really the problem. They know nothing too, but it's the bourgeoisie who pretend to run the world, and they know nothing. Oh. Yes. Oh, yes. Go ahead.
Can you explain for us how, out of this cataclysm of conflict between left and right in the capital of France, within 10 years, there actually was a republic, notwithstanding the decisive military victory of the right and the deportation of the Commune and all that. How did the republic actually succeed, given all these forces, beyond the fact that the would-be king, was so unacceptable that he didn't resume royalism?
That's an astonishing story. I don't know quite how to explain it. Thiers was a real bastard, but he was also politically very adept. He said, the republic is the regime that divides us least. And I think that it really comes about in a kind of negative way, that on the one hand, socialists, on the other hand, monarchists, the republic sort of slips down the middle. And when the republic gets going following the Commune, there actually is an agreement not to decide on the form of the government. In the assembly in 1871, that's left as a blank, and the assumption is that the monarchy will be restored. And it's only when you get to the Ville Amendment a few years later that it officially is entered into the record that the government of France will be a republic, and it wins. Ville Amendment wins by 1 vote. So it's a very precarious thing.
Yes, I was interested when you kept mentioning the sort of metaphors of volcanic eruption, because the same themes were appearing in late 19th century British narratives of the city. The sense of people sitting on a volcanic eruption, liable to blow at any moment. I'm just wondering, was there something going on? Was there more archaeological evidence of volcanic eruptions, or was there more narratives of volcanology? Why was this metaphor suddenly appearing for urbanizing societies?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. Of course, meditations on the slopes of Vesuvius and Etna are fairly common in the early 19th century. I mean, Byron's Childe Harold, Chateaubriand in France, and so on. So the image of these dormant but enormously destructive volcanoes are there, and they're not far away in Italy, right? And so I think this comparison comes fairly naturally to people's minds. And then to equate the volcano with the populace, for right-wing writers is too much of a temptation to be resisted.
I have one comment on the previous question. How did the Republic succeed in carrying the day? The explanation I had when I took history was that the royalists were divided among themselves. You had legitimatist Bourbons, you had Orleanist Bourbons, and then you had Bonapartists, and they just couldn't agree among themselves.
Yes, but they came to a so-called fusion. The Comte de Chambord, who was the Bourbon pretender to the throne, was childless. So the fusion, this worked out in 1873 1873, I think, or maybe that summer of 1874, I think it was 1873, said that Chambord would become king as Henri V, and when he died, the throne would pass to the Orléans branch, which is the branch of Louis Philippe, right, and the Comte de Paris. So they had worked that all out, finally. It took 75 years, but they had worked it out.
Did any other French writers write about the Commune in their fiction? Maupassant, for example?
There is, it's interesting, there is one writer who who writes directly about his experience as a communal, and that's Jules Vallès, though his novel L'Insurgé doesn't appear till a good deal later, around mid-1880s. There are a lot of people later on who return to the Commune, and it's funny. It's one of these events that, as history has gone on, has become more and more important rather than less important. And the amount of historiographical material being produced, I can't even keep up with it. And really very interesting reinterpretations, not only of the politics, but of the aesthetics of the time. I've just been reading a book by a woman named Kristen Ross who teaches at NYU about the meaning of the destruction of the column of the Place Vendôme and the attempt to create a new kind of communal aesthetics connected to William Morris in England, who's better known, for his craftsman movement. But there was a lot of that. Every man an artist, participatory artistry. So this is straying a little bit from your question about a novelist, but it is something which is, I'd say, more and more talked about by novelists and artists as time goes by. Yeah.
So as you were speaking about the photograph as an eyewitness, so the past becomes as certain as the present, I was thinking about that in relation to the obviously manipulated image that you pointed out earlier. And I know that later in the century that kind of editing and manipulation of photographs became sort of popular. I wondered if you came across any other photographs that had been edited to present any particular point of view.
Other photographs?
Yeah, so the photograph, the fireman putting out the fire that had been added later, did you find any other photographs that had been manipulated in that way?
Yeah, that's an interesting question about the manipulation of photographs. The ones I showed, except for that one, I promise you are not manipulated, but there are a lot of manipulated photographs. And I kept them out of the show partly because I didn't want to confuse people. For instance, there's a very artfully posed pile of corpses of National Guardsmen. But as you study it, you realize that this is a posed pictures. There's some pictures of killed children lying in a Paris street. But the poses, the way you realize that the thing is artificial. There's something wrong about it. Then there's Eugène Appert, who really was an early exponent of Photoshop, right? I mean, he takes faces from portraits and he puts them on bodies and rearranges them all. So there's a lot of manipulation going on. And it's interesting because people have said that at the trial of the communals, the photographs were used as evidence. Well, I don't know how much they counted as evidence, but if they did, they shouldn't have, right? So my point is really the real evidence is the ruins.
I think I fall in the category of those who are fascinated with the morbid that you pointed out. But that photo of the corpses arranged in the grave, so meticulously, it seems. They were the first layer, they seem to be wearing just white, plain white garments, and those that are on the layer on top are more fancily dressed. Is that Was there any lesson in that, or?
It could have been that the photographer wanted that. You notice that they have numbers on them too. And I think the numbers, I can't tell, because I've never examined the original of this the way I have of the Rebirth, whether the numbers were added on the photograph or were they on the corpses. I think they're on the corpses, because if you look in the lower row, for instance, it looks as if some of them are on paper tickets or stickers, right, on the corpses. So there's evidently some record being created here, some register being kept of the dead. And I don't know at whose behest. I think it's an absolutely stunning photograph. Horrible.
I think we will have to stop there, so please join me in thanking Dr. Peter.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.